Okay. Welcome back, everyone. This is week 7, Intro to Corrections, and we are going to be talking about issues in corrections. And so, real quickly, just want to remind you that this week, the readings for chapter 6 and 7 in text 1 and unit 3 in text 2. Obviously, we read chapter 7 last week, but it directly ties into this week, so it's important to just kind of go over that again. So, as we go into it, a brief recap of chapter 7. Like I said, we talked about it last week. Watch that video for the full in depth, go through that stuff. But the big highlights and what they're going to play into this week's content is aging population, female prisoners, rehabilitative model, drugs, addiction, and mental health, and the California rehabilitative reform. So just a real brief reminder of that. So the aging population is a big issue in the corrections field now, and it has been for a little bit. But the issue is that as sentences are longer and prisoners are getting older, there are physical limitations and health requirements of older inmates that were not considered, not planned when developing the prison system, when going through these kinds of healthcare. As we've talked about in this class, among other classes, healthcare is available to prisoners, but it's not the same quality of healthcare that you would get out and about. So the problem here is that, well, that prison population, as they get older, they have different requirements for healthcare, and they're not getting those needs met. And in places where there's bunk beds or certain levels of like open shower plans and things like that, an aging population might need support bars, handles. They cannot climb as high as they get older. They lose muscle mass, and so they can't quite work as long or as hard as they used to. So the aging population itself is a real issue within corrections, and it's a how do we still go through this process that has been set out for everyone, but there are unique situations we have to deal with. Female prisoners in a similar but very different way as the aging population. This comes down to, again, a very physical requirement difference that male prisoners do not have, and that is the fact that female prisoners have the opportunity to be pregnant and to give birth. And that's something that male prisoners physically cannot do. And so that's an issue within corrections, is how do we treat pregnant offenders differently, as we've had in our first what if scenario. How do you deal with a pregnant inmate? Like, this is something that is not an easy answer, and it's something that we continue to push for. So this is an issue in corrections, that we have two different diverse populations in the system that need unique services that are not initially or originally planned on. So with the female prisoners, and this is related to California rehabilitative model reform and the other stuff, but one of the key focuses when we talk about female prisoners, the focus for them is on family reconnection, so reconnecting and keeping that connection with their children. It's important to note this is just a side observation, something that if you hadn't thought of this before, maybe this is the first time you're thinking this, but the emphasis is on female prisoners being reformed and being reunited with their children. That is not necessarily the same focus in a male facility. Is it possible? Yes. But is it the main focus? Not like with female prisoners. So just a thought put out there. So the rehabilitative model, drugs, addiction, and mental health. One of the issues in the criminal justice field, and we've talked about it before, the 1970s, we saw the war on drugs. And this was a very deliberate and focused move. We also saw the closing of mental asylums and things of that nature. And so we were putting so many people into prisons that didn't need to be there. And then on top of that, there was a shift again in about the 1960s, 1970s, being hard on crime, hard on prisoners, and so it went from rehabilitative to punitive or punishment, and so we saw more people getting sentenced and longer sentences. We saw rise in drug addiction, both from people that are going into prison and people who are already in prison, and the deterioration of mental health for everyone across the board. So it's important to remind us of this. And remember that the California Rehabilitative Reform, California spearheaded this whole idea of we need to fix the correctional system and we need to focus on rehabilitation. And it's not just rehabilitation for offenders so that they can no longer re-offend, but also to focus on that drug and addiction and saying, okay, sometimes these people are here because they cannot help themselves and they need help. And so the whole idea is that the California Rehabilitative Reform collected the data, looked at everything, and said, how do we change this? And what they did was they evidence-based practice and changed. They collected the data and said, this is what works, this is what doesn't work, let's do this. So, that was chapter 7. Now we go back in the textbook, technically a chapter, and we're talking about chapter 6. And chapter 6 is all about institutionalization. And this is a term that we are going to define here in a minute, but I want to at least talk about this briefly. Institutionalization is the fact that I guess I need to define it first. So let's jump slides a little bit. So what is institutionalization? It's the way in which people are shaped and transformed over an extended period of time by the institutional environments in which they live. That's the fancy definition. It's, in a more simpler terms, how we survive, we create a new normal. And please note, these are not normal behaviors or beliefs, but to survive in a unique environment, this acts as normal. So, institutionalization, to take that big fancy definition and the short forms, the idea of institutionalization is that when an individual is in a particular environment, and this can be corporate environment, this can be prison environment, this can be whatever it may be, when you are in a particular environment, eventually you change your manners, your beliefs, your understanding, how you respond, how you work to fit that environment. This is something that cults use all the time within its, we call it brainwashing when we talk about cults, but it's the idea that you isolate from everyone else and you learn that this is what you need and you become reliant on this. Institutionalization happens at a lot of different levels, and it's important to note this is not a one and done it happens. This is over time. So how it's related here is in prison, we have an issue of prisoners upon release struggling to rehabilitate and adjust to life outside of prison. And if you know anyone who has been to prison, or you know anyone who has a relative or a friend or something that was in prison for an extended period of time, you will hear people talk about how it's hard for them to transition to life outside of prison. Same thing goes for military. If you know anyone who's been like a lifelong military person, transitioning to civilian life, it's the same thing. It's this institutionalization. You are used to the one environment. And so when we're talking about it here, we're talking about this within criminal justice. So keep that in mind. While it is something that is universal and is widespread, we're going to be talking about institutionalization within the criminal justice system, within corrections. And so we look at, how do we get here? How did we get to this point where we have institutionalization? And this is an issue in corrections, by the way. So how we got here was incarceration rates. We saw an increase in the incarceration rates, the size of the prison population getting larger. We saw overpopulation and widespread overcrowding across all the prisons across the United States. And we also saw that in the 1970s, the shift from rehabilitative to punitive. Again, that war on drugs, we saw the shift from being uh, let's change people's minds, let's help them heal, to we need to get hard on crime. So it's important to note, and this is a thing directly from the text, and um, if you've been interested in this field for a while, you would have heard this already, but the U.S. prison population is roughly 4 to 8 times larger than that of the other nations of the world, and that's according to the data that we have. Like, put that into perspective. Our prison population in the United States alone is roughly 4 to 8 times larger than any other country. That is an insanely high number of people who are incarcerated. And we've talked about it before. There are issues of false incarcerations, false arrests, things like that. So it's not like it's just oh, well, that means there's more criminals here in the United States. No, we have deeper spread issues here. But what we saw, or rather what is a direct result of this, is that because of the overpopulation and overcrowding and all these other changes, we saw that there was less funding and support for needed programs. All of a sudden, the funding wasn't going up, despite the fact that the population was increasing. Incarceration rates were increasing. The budget didn't increase for these programs. The prisons couldn't change. They couldn't add new wings. They couldn't add more cells. They were just doubling up, doubling up, doubling up. And this had a very direct result. And that result ended up being that the conditions got worse and worse. So all of a sudden, the traditional programming that was available, the pre-release programs, mental health, those were declining. They weren't being able to be offered. So all of this overcrowding stuff led to the decline in quality and access to the programs, the living conditions, the management of the prison itself, as well as safety. So there were a lot of issues that were just compounding. And compounding is just a fancy word for saying kept building up on each other. So we had all these problems that just, we have had an issue. And I'm sure if you pay attention to the general nationwide news, we still have a problem of overcrowding in prisons. And to kind of put some things in perspective for everyone briefly, I just want to remind you that COVID-19 happened in 2020. We survived a pandemic. We've lived through it. While it's still here, it's not nearly as prominent as it was in 2020. But COVID-19 required changes. It required, social distancing, medical testing, things like that. And if you're thinking, yeah, I remember I had to quarantine, it sucked, I urge you to remember that prisoners have the same basic human rights and the right to, being healthy. And so prisons had to legally follow COVID-19 protocols as well. And that's something that I don't think we've really talked about or thought about within the criminal justice field. The requirements for health and safety from COVID-19 had a direct impact on prisons and prison population as a whole. There's not a whole lot of data on it yet because it's still so fresh, but I would be interested in the next couple years to see what kind of research data looks at, 5 years from post-COVID, 10 years post-COVID, the effect it had on the criminal justice system. Like I said, it's still new enough that there's not a lot of data on it, but it's something to bring up simply because we are living proof of this. We lived through it. This is recent memory. This is something that will, if you're interested and you plan on going into criminal justice, this is something to keep in mind as we continue forward. That this is going to be something that we need to talk about and will probably be related to this kind of reform or issues within corrections. So, in general, related to just, again, overpopulation, overcrowding, and things like that, the general consensus across the board from psychologists, criminologists, things of that nature, is that prison does have an impact on people. Not necessarily, yeah, we'll get to that in a second. Not necessarily like a severe impact and not necessarily a lifelong impact, but across the board, the idea is that time spent in prison will have an impact on a person's life, one way or another. What they do agree on, though, is also that the best prison will probably least negatively affect someone. You're looking at maybe like a year of old habits, maybe less. But the worse the conditions and the punishment of the place, the worse the effects on mental health are going to be, and the longer that they're going to stay. And so, with that being said, and again, talking about institutionalization and creating this new normal, this is where we get into the meat and potatoes of this. So, the results of institutionalization. And so, again, it's important to note that prison life, time incarcerated, affects everyone. It's not just a, oh, I went to prison for 2 years, and you know what? First day out, I feel great. No, there tends to be some kind of adjustment period. But when an individual is incarcerated for an extended period of time, some of those strategies to survive in that environment can bleed out into your everyday life. And so our text talks about these. They have their own pretty much chapters for each, but I just want to go through some of these and talk about what they really are. So sometimes, this is not all the time, but sometimes due to relinquishing, as the textbook puts it, relinquishing is just a fancy word for giving up. But when you give up your autonomy, your sense of independence and self-being, when you give up that when you go into prison, because you do not have that autonomy, you are on a schedule set by the prison itself. You are set on a schedule of the prisoners and the guards and everyone else. It is not your decision. But when you give up a lot of that, you tend to grow reliant on the institution. You lose that autonomy. So all of a sudden, when you are potentially released, if you've been there for a long time, having the freedom to wake up whenever you want, do whatever you want at any time, that sense of freedom is overwhelming and it's difficult. Again, this is something that comes back to long incarcerated at high security level facilities. Individuals who are released end up struggling with not having the strict regime and the regiment and the day-to-day activities of prison. So this is a real problem when they get out into the free society, so to speak. Another result of this institutionalization and this new normal within the prison is hypervigilance and the fight or flight response. And so real briefly, before I go into this, I just want to remind people that fight or flight response, it is, in more recent years, we have done more research and now we refer to it as the fight, flight, or freeze response because flight is running away, fight is obviously staying there, standing your ground and fighting, but freeze is a real response to danger, and that's where you cannot move. You pretty much lock up mentally and you're just kind of there. So that is part of this, but in this institutionalization prison setting, we tend to see the fight or flight. And so, what this means, hypervigilance is being always on alert, always watching everything around you, what's behind you. It, the whole idea is that since you are in an unsafe place where the tough exploit the weak, you have to come up with this deep distrust for anyone. Anyone could easily turn on you and attack. And so you're always on alert and you're always looking to make sure that you have an easy way out or that you can be safe, that you can protect yourself. This hypervigilance, when you release from prison and go back to a an average life outside of the institution, is there a need to be hypervigilant? Some people might say yes, but a lot of people are going to say no. It's the idea that, you have a hard time trusting anyone, which we're going to get down to here in just a second. But there are a lot of connected issues with being hypervigilant and always ready for the fight or flight response, especially if your response is to fight because you had to adopt a tough persona. This leads to people reoffending, or rather being charged with assault. They fight and then they get charged with a new crime and then are put back in the system. It's a whole nother issue. So I said tough persona, tough facade, tough mask. And so this next piece, masking and social disintegration, is directly connected to hypervigilance. And I want to briefly talk, what is masking? If you've not heard the term before, masking is the idea that you put on a forward-facing or public-facing idea or image, and that's not who you really are. It's just the way you present yourself to other people, and then behind that, your real person is different from that individual that you are putting forward. So that's masking. Sometimes you may have heard it from masking your pain, where you may be really depressed and sad and not okay, but you put on a smile and you're masking that. The idea is that you are pretending to be something else. You are putting something forward. You're putting an image forward to hide what you really are. It is a form of self-imposed protection. This is more of a psychology thing, but it's important to note because it does come up specifically in corrections a lot. But so masking itself does lead to social disintegration. And social disintegration is the wonderful, widespread catch-all term for relationships diminish and deteriorate. We're talking both intimate relationships, romantic relationships, friendships, everything. The idea is that when you are always putting on a fake self, you are building walls. And again, this is all psychology here, but it has such a wide reaching influence within criminal justice that it's important to know this. By building walls and protections against people getting close, all of a sudden this leads to this distance and isolation from other individuals. Um, it can also lead to, if you're always masking your emotions, this leads to emotional flatness. And I would argue um, very strongly that part of the issue of toxic masculinity is this idea of emotional flatness and masking. The idea that boys don't cry, boys are tough, that kind of thing. The toxic masculinity belief is all about emotional flatness and masking. And so you can see that it's not criminal justice, but it is definitely a real world example you can look to. But this idea that social disintegration happens from this isolation, this pretending to be someone different, this distancing yourself, being disconnected or emotionally. Um, and so, an additional piece of all this masking and social disintegration, especially within the former convicted, the released individual, what we see is an idea of emotional control. And I put control in quotations here. Emotional control is not really control over your emotions, it is just really good masking. And this leads to the idea of what some people say dead inside, where you don't feel those strong emotions. It's because you've repressed them so much, you have so much control over how you can and should feel, that completely, it messes with your empathy, it messes with how you appropriately respond to things. There are, like I said, some widespread and wide reaching impacts of this. And if you want to know more about this, please take a psychology class. Feel free to ask them about emotional masking and things like that, and you'll learn more about it there. But it's important to note that when an inmate is in these unsafe environments in an institution, in a prison, you have to put on this tough guy facade, because the tough will exploit the weak. That's something that experts will say across the board. The strong prisoners will pick on the weak, and it's a dog eat dog world in there. And so that leads to all these compounding, building up multiple piece issues that once you're released from prison, it's difficult to take those away or to change those. And again, as I kind of hinted at, this is all because of the prisoner culture and norms. It's not what admin says, it's not what the guards say. It's the fact that, and you've heard it from me, and I believe actually you'll hear it from Lieutenant Mike Holman in the interview, but prisons are mini societies. They are their own community within the community. And so there are norms and cultures that form, and they happen organically. They can't be forced. And so that has a direct result. Um, and we're going to talk about an example of that here in just a little bit. But so something that does end up happening as a result of this is that we sometimes see a loss of self worth and personal value. And what this means is that personal value is not values like what you believe are good things. No, it's you feel that you're not worth anything. You are worthless. Self-worth and personal value, you don't value your life. You don't value who you are. And this is a direct result of lack of privacy while in jail, in prisons, lack of autonomy, this masking and cultural stimuli that you have to abide by. All of a sudden, when you're released from that, it's hard to feel like you're worth something, especially when there's a stigma of, oh, you were in prison. You have that stigma attached to you that you are a bad person. Could very well be not true. And perhaps the most understandable and relatable thing that we can talk about that is a result of institutionalization that I don't really need to talk too much about, but it's important to note is post traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Um, this is something that, as we've gotten better as a society as a whole, we understand more about post traumatic stress disorder. But in case you don't know what post traumatic stress disorder is that after a traumatic event, something that has deeply affected an individual's life, there tends to be some issues where the body both physically will change, like the chemicals in your brain change, your heart rate, you get there's a lot of issues with it. It is a psychological issue, but it does have biological effects from the psychological. The idea is that after some kind of trauma that you are forever changed and there are some issues. Um, and PTSD is very common. So I'm not talking in generalized terms. I'm talking realistically speaking. Post traumatic stress disorder is fairly common among people. Um, the ones that we talk about the most are soldiers returning from war tend to have PTSD. This used to be called shell shock, but now that we understand a lot more about it, we understand that it's post traumatic stress disorder. Uh, Victims of crime have PTSD. Um, Sexual assault survivors, um, new parents. Uh, there's postpartum depression in mothers, but there can be PTSD if part of the pregnancy or birth process was especially bad. Um, Individuals that just, funerals, deaths in the family. This is where I say trauma is not a one to one thing. An event could be traumatic for one person, but be very casual for another. Trauma is not a one to one. People experience trauma differently. And so, because of that, we need to understand that PTSD people can struggle to adapt and make sense of what happened. And because prison itself is a very different culture, we see that post traumatic stress disorder gets diagnosed and recognized pretty frequently within people who are released from prison. Um, but there's an additional piece to this. Most inmates already suffer from unseen or maybe even seen past trauma. As we've talked about before, a lot of criminals, they have had some kind of childhood trauma and they act out. That's how they respond. They commit crime. And so, because of this unseen or seen past trauma, that prison life often revisits that trauma, whether through a lack of proper support or an event or something that happens within prison. It just reignites that trauma. You re-experience it, and it just happens all over again. But what we see is after prison, without a proper support system outside of the prison, no tight knit group of friends or family or people that care to get you that support and help. This leads to the negative outcomes and responses from PTSD, which, unfortunately, slight trigger warning. One of the more extreme but common responses from PTSD is suicide. Um, this could be drug use and abuse, alcoholism, um, self inflicted violence. This can be any number of things. Um, to make a long story short, um, when individuals spend such an extended period of time within a unique area where you are not safe, where you are hyper vigilant, that is traumatic, and when you are released, there is a very real possibility that you will have PTSD. The question is how long. Well, it depends on you. It's one of those things that changes across the board. um, yeah, didn't want to get too depressed, so we're going to move on, but just know that PTSD is fairly common in post-release prisoners, especially from long periods of incarceration. All right, so to shift gears a little bit, this is still issues within corrections, but from our text 3, unit 3 talks about case management strategies. And what I really want to emphasize with this in particular is that, so these are the strategies or ways to uh, connect with an inmate to make sure that they are getting the proper care that they need. And so this is covered under issues. The issues are that sometimes they're not as upfront. Sometimes they are very opposed to getting help. Sometimes, so these are sub issues, but these are some of the management strategies that are suggested based off of evidence based practices. Just wanted to throw that word out yet again. So, the whole text itself has multiple different pieces, but these are the big areas that we should focus on. And that is the first thing, and across the board, it should seem very obvious, hopefully, but the first step in any positive change and positive impact in, I would argue, not just in the correctional facilities or in the relationship between correctional officer or case manager and a prisoner. Heck, this is student and teacher. This is uh, relationships. This is friendships. You need to establish rapport. Yes, it is pronounced rapport if you haven't heard by this point. So establish rapport. All that means, it's a fancy way of saying that you build an open and honest communication that builds trust. Rapport is that you have some kind of understood, both parties understand where you are and how honest and open you are. Um, so establishing rapport is important, but a very important part because of the dynamic. And again, this is not just criminal justice, but this is, teacher student, boss subordinate, police officer citizen, case manager, inmate. The important piece is that you have to build an open and honest communication and to build trust, but you need to maintain appropriate boundaries. It is completely inappropriate for a case manager to act very, very, very friendly and almost like a best friend to an inmate. We talk about it all the time in the news because it's way too common, but teachers who have romantic relationships with their students, that is inappropriate boundaries. That is going well past what building rapport and establishing rapport is supposed to be. We see it as we talked about scandals in corrections, and I asked you to look it up. Some of you even mentioned it. Yeah, we have scandals of guards and COs and case managers sleeping with, or sexually assaulting rather, the inmates. That is inappropriate boundaries. So it's important that, yes, you need to build trust and you want that person to be open with you, but you need to be able to maintain that appropriate boundary. Motivational interviewing is the second thing that the text talks about, and boy, it seems like a really obvious and simple thing, but it's connecting the offender's need for change with something they care about. And so it's in this early stages, this is how you figure out what an inmate needs to best succeed to readjust back to normal society, and that is, what exactly do they need to change and what's going to best motivate them. And so the most common one that people see is seeing my kids. You you connect the desire to be reunited with your family. You use that as the motivation for, okay, this is how we change. Another one that you see is, I want to own my own business. All right, well, you can't do that if you are addicted to methamphetamines. We need to get you off that. That kind of idea. You use the motivation that they have, something that the inmate themselves personally really wants, and you use that as the sounding board for, okay, how do we get you to change the bad behaviors so that you can achieve that goal. So obviously that makes perfect sense. Obviously, assessment for proper treatment plans. We're going to talk about this one in particular, but as we've talked about several times, the best and proper reentry programs start on the first day. The moment they come in, they are on their path. And the best way to do that is to assess what is going to be the best thing. So proper treatment plans are a godsend. They are the things that you need to make sure that your inmates are in the proper programming that's going to help them rehabilitate and readjust to society. And so the one that our book, or rather the text 2, uses is the level of service inventory revised, the LSIR. Obviously, there was the level of service inventory in the 1980s, and then they revamped it and revised it in the 90s. But it's by Andrews and Bonta, and the whole purpose of the proper treatment, or the level of service inventory, was to measure the static and dynamic risk factors. So what they were doing is they were looking at all the different risk factors that an individual has and seeing, okay, based off of this, what are the things that can be changed, what can't be changed, how severe are they, what kind of program will work best for it. It's literally looking at it and saying, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is this? How bad is this? That's the very basic breakdown. But I want to talk about the two terms that I brought up, static and dynamic risk factors. So, static risk factors are things that cannot be changed through treatment. And what I mean is static, in case you haven't learned, static means that it stays the same. It is a constant. Static characters, if you're English and you know stories, static characters have no change. They are just the same all throughout. So static risk factors are things that you cannot influence. These are things like the age of the inmate. You can't change their age. If we could change age, that would change so much other things about our world. But you can't change your age. You can't change your ethnicity. You can't change your race. You can change a lot of other things. Dynamic risk factors can be changed through treatment. And so the big example is addiction. Addiction is a dynamic risk factor because, yeah, there was a point in time where you were not addicted and then you got addicted. So there's a way that could change. It's just important to understand that in measuring both, you see what kind of program is going to work best. And so what they found is that, younger inmates tend to be more violent. They tend to, going back to our example of masking in that persona, younger inmates are going to be more willing to be the violent offender, the outward-facing tough persona. So that is technically a dynamic change, but their static factor is that it's their age. The younger age is a problem. So, maybe this type of program is not going to work until they're a little bit older. That kind of idea. So it's taking both pieces and saying, okay, how do we make this work together? And then the text ends with this piece, and I think this is a really good just way to kind of bring this all together, and that's counseling. Obviously, we've talked about mental health in this class a decent amount, and counseling is a helpful tool in readjusting, rehabilitating individuals. If you remember, a lot of them suffer from PTSD, a lot of them suffer from a past trauma. And so, counseling, whether it be drug counseling for drug addiction or alcoholic counseling for alcoholism or mental health counseling because of trauma, the idea of working through it and talking through it does tend to have a positive outcome. But in counseling, the text puts forward four distinct ones, and I want to talk about it. Non-directive counseling is the client guides the counseling. This tends to be for, more readily to readjust to society type. Um, Non-directive means that the client is talking about what their issue is. So the inmate is talking and figuring out where do they need to go in counseling. What issues do they have? What do they want to overcome? How do they get there? Directive counseling, on the other hand, is where an individual, typically case manager or correctional officer or someone, is guiding the counseling towards a specific goal. If we remember back to going even on this one, we go back to the assessment of proper treatment plans. The directive counseling is making sure that it is going towards that particular goal. I want to talk about CBT in particular, cognitive behavioral therapy. It sounds scary, but it's not. The idea is that you focus on changing negative thought patterns. It is recognizing the way that your brain works and trying to change those negative behaviors, trying to change the way that our brains default. So, for cognitive behavioral therapy, instead of going, I'm going to commit a crime because I want to do that, well, why did that happen? Why did my brain say, let's commit this crime? And you explore that, and typically you're able to change the thought process. It has a lot to do with that id, going back to psychology, the id, the ego, the superego, the primal urge and thought to do things. The whole CBT is a very interesting and, I would argue, a good strategy of therapy that in counseling that does seem to work. But then there's group counseling, and this one is one that we tend to forget about, but it allows a safe space for social interactions so that, when they are released, it's not, I don't know how to talk to people. It's, no, you've had that practice in group. But it also allows everyone there to be the counselor and the counseled. So all the clients that are in that group counseling session, they can work through those issues together and share experiences and bond, and it does have a positive impact. Sometimes a big issue with mental health in general is that it feels very isolating, and if we go back to some of the issues of our results of institutionalization, there is the issue of social disintegration, which leads to isolation. So it's a chance to help address that. And with that, that's the end of the notes. However, I want to bring up one thing that is related to our discussion board, and it's important because it's also mentioned in the text. The Stanford Prison Experiment. This is difficult. And by difficult, I mean it's like emotionally and mentally difficult to work through. There is a web link on the discussion board, but it's also directly at the end of chapter 6.7. 6.7 has a link to the web page. I want you to read through the text part of that web page. It's like 8 pages long. It's going through all the steps of the experiment itself. Very brief rundown to give you an idea what it is so that you're not completely shocked when you read through it. The Stanford Prison Experiment was all about individuals in psychology in the University of Stanford uh, or Stanford University. The idea was that they wanted to explore the psychological effects of incarceration in a prison setting. And so this was done with college students, not prison guards, not former criminals, not criminals. This was students. And they created a fake secure jail prison cell in the basement of the psychology department. And the experiment was supposed to run for a couple weeks, and it ended after 6 days. Um, there are some wide-reaching results from that experiment. It's a big reason why all experiments done at a college need to be approved if they're using human subjects. Um, yeah, just know that the students were broken up. 50% of them were guards, 50% of them were inmates, and they were chosen at random, basically the flip of a coin. So there were no, like, students of wealth got to be the guards and poverty. No, it was all random. So please read through that. That'll be relevant to the discussion board. That's the whole focus of the discussion board. But this also is a perfect, direct kind of case study to look at when talking about issues in corrections. Especially when we talk about institutionalization and the life on the outside. So, with that being said, thank you very much. Do know that Stanford Prison Experiment is brutal and it is not to be taken lightly. But please read through it, and if you have questions, please let me know. Like I said, it's not an easy read. But anyway, thank you very much, and I'll see you all soon.